The GBA Fire Emblem games are the most popular in the series for ROM hacks, and there have been many great ones over the years. The newest one of these ROM hacks is called Andaron Saga, one of the more ambitious projects, with a whole team of modders, testers, artists, and musicians working on it. Let's take an in-depth look at its level design and general gameplay, and see what it does right and what it does wrong. Before we start, this video is not intended to convince you to play the game. It is meant for those who have already played it, as a discussion on what makes ROM hacks good and what should be avoided. The FE8 modding community is still going strong, so I think it will be useful to discuss those ideas for future projects. Andaron Saga is really well made and probably the best FE8 ROM hack I've ever played, at least yet. But I find that praising games with no reason as to why they're so great is just as useless as baseless criticism, so I will try to get in great detail over small things, so don't start complaining about nitpicking. Also, I'm not going to avoid spoilers, so don't watch if you haven't played the game. We're at the very start and I was already pleasantly surprised. There are so many ROM hacks that do a massive exposition dump right from the beginning, explaining all the lore and history in the past 1000 years. Look, I'm sorry, but no one's reading all of that, and even if they did, they won't remember anything. I know that even some big games make this mistake, but this is really bad practice. The player is not yet invested into your game, they want to know whether it's something they'll enjoy playing first, and then if they really like it, they might want to read all the lore then. And that's not something every player likes to do. Even if you worked on the story very hard and it is genuinely good, you need to sell them on the gameplay first, and then present them the story. Yes, some Fire Emblem games do that as well, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. It gives people a really bad first impression. I only recently played some of the older games like Fire Emblem 4, and going through so much text at the start of the game, and so many characters introduced right away, did not make it easy for me to get into the game. And that's a game from a series I like. If the player just loads up your ROM hack and gets greeted by a wall of text, and then gets introduced to a party of 10 to 20 characters all talking about some nonsense that you have no idea about, they will probably just quit and pick something else to play. Andaron Saga does a great job of gradually introducing characters one by one, so the player doesn't feel overwhelmed, and it leaves all the world building and lore in optional dialogue for players who really like to read. I think that's a great approach and it gives the player a very good first impression. But story is not important, I'm just here for the gameplay, you might say. It is true that most games don't really need a story. However, in this case I would disagree. Fire Emblem is an RPG, and in RPGs, a good story is a must. It doesn't have to be amazing, just something to get you motivated and move the plot. But even more important than the story are the characters. If the player isn't invested in them, they won't really care if units die, and they also won't feel as fulfilled when they train them. But talking about all the characters in detail would make this video 3 hours long, so maybe we can do that another time. Generally the characters are okay, I like some of them and I dislike others. The game gives you enough characters that you can pick your favorites and still have a good team, so I'm pretty happy with the roster. And the story itself? I liked it a lot. It wasn't perfect, but it was an engaging story and the main characters were very likable, so you actually cared about what happened to them. The game has a lot of twists and they're not that obvious, but also not totally out of nowhere. One thing I thought was a weak point was Randall's character. I get that he's supposed to be this cruel might makes right kind of guy, I don't have an issue with that. But those sorts of characters are only interesting if they can actually back up their words. And Randall is honestly kind of a joke. He seems inept at keeping his subjects under control, everyone plots against him and he doesn't catch it. He just talks big and never really does anything impressive. Even though I didn't know what exactly the twist would be, I knew that Randall would not be a big challenge and that there would be a different final boss pretty quickly after he got into power. I think it would have been more interesting if Randall actually seemed like a big threat and was presented in a better way. Morty is a much more interesting villain. I wouldn't say that his plan makes perfect sense, but that's usually how it goes with these games. I suppose one thing that can help is not hyping up his master plan for so long. We often see that in games where the villain is supposedly not really evil, he just has this brilliant plan that we're too dumb to comprehend. And every other character will tell us that once the plan gets revealed, it will all magically make sense. In these situations, the expectations from the player are always so high because we hear about this plan all the time throughout the game, and it's hard to meet those expectations at the end, after the player has seen all the war crimes committed to justify this plan. But besides that, the clashes and schemes of all the different houses and the history of the world was really enjoyable, which is why I would rate the overall story very highly. The music is great. It sounds like a Fire Emblem game, and there are lots of unique tracks for the different maps and for all the different characters. All the songs were made for this, although some were remakes, I believe, so there aren't any that feel out of place. The visuals are also kept similar to the original game, with no weird looking menus or out of place effects, but there are lots of custom animations and palettes in the style of FE8. Okay, so we have a good introduction and a decent story, some good visuals and sounds, but we also need good gameplay. So how is the map design? Even in the very first arc I noticed that there are lots of maps with a time limit. Survive for X turns, hard turn timers and soft turn timers, where lots of powerful units start chasing you after a certain amount of turns pass. I think turn limits are a controversial topic, as not everyone seems to like them, but I believe that they are a must in a turn-based game, especially in Fire Emblem. There are just way too many ways to cheese the game if you had infinite time. You can expect players to not take advantage of all of them. Yeah, they might not lose the most deranged ones, such as disarming someone that takes no damage and farming 1 EXP per attack, but they will most certainly play slow and pull enemies one at a time, or do some minor boss abuse, and that kinda makes the game boring. But besides the turn limits, the first arc is fairly straightforward. The chapters are interesting, but nothing too crazy. The only weird map is Chapter 5, where you only have 2 units. It's interesting from a story perspective, and there is an interesting gimmick that your 2 units can only fight one type of character, which gets ruined if you pick Dawncaller. Oh, did I mention your choices actually matter in this game? You get asked to make important decisions from time to time, and they have an impact on the gameplay, with picking Dawncaller or not being the most impactful choice. Those kinds of choices are obviously great, but they're pretty time consuming to make, so you should always appreciate games that have them. Now back to the 2-unit chapter. It's cute, but those maps are not that fun to play, especially when you replay them. Yeah, the first time it's alright, but I really don't want to replay this chapter. And why is that? Well, Fire Emblem is a game that offers tons of replayability. You can pick different units, get different level ups, even get different skills, promotions, and supports, or try harder difficulties, or even some kind of a challenge. Once you remove all of those choices and have a chapter with 2 units, it limits how you can play the game and makes the map a lot more linear. I can understand why the chapter exists, but I'm glad that there's only one like it. Well, technically there's the fight against Randall, but that one is way too short, so I don't have an issue with it. Maybe Chapter 5 could have also been a little shorter. After that, it's smooth sailing for a while, and the big change happens in Chapter 13, where we lose control of Baut, and we have to rescue him from jail. But he comes back, right? So yeah, spoilers, he's dead. And losing what you think is your lore character is kind of a big deal. Now, the thing about losing characters due to plot in Fire Emblem is that it's a double-edged sword. It really sucks from a gameplay perspective, because maybe you really like the unit and you invested a lot into it, and then he's dead and now you're really mad. But if the characters never die, then you can't really have a serious and dark story because the player will always know that everyone in the army will survive. So ultimately the decision comes to this: do you value the story and setting of the game more than you value some minor frustrations that the players might experience? And there really is no correct answer to this. But I will say that Andaron Saga is pretty close to crossing the line of being kind of annoying by taking away characters from you. There are quite a few that leave: Baut, Ilanda, Samuel, and Theo for only a few chapters. Technically Natalie, Jaheira, and Angelos can also leave, but that's your choice. Oh, and you can make Garm leave permanently. Personally, what I'm looking for from a Fire Emblem game is to have this epic campaign where I train my units and watch them grow throughout, and I get really annoyed when some of them get removed for plot reasons, or god forbid, we skip to an entirely different cast of units. The only game that did that okay was Genealogy, but that was the whole point of the game. It's like having two campaigns. So yeah, what I'm saying is, be careful with that stuff, don't overdo it. The difficulty is pretty well done. Normal is easy, hard is a decent challenge for a first playthrough, and Wounding is pretty difficult, but it isn't the kind of difficulty that's just RNG and making you replay chapters, or the kind of difficulty that screws you up the first time because you don't know what to expect and the game makes you reset. Yeah, obviously if you played it once, it will be a lot easier once you know what to expect, but it's certainly doable blind without too many issues. The game is also Iron Man friendly because you get a lot of characters, few game over conditions, and your items go to convoy if a unit dies. My only issue with RNG and Iron Man unfriendliness is the Evil Eye enemy. The chapter they appear in, Tomb of Terrors, is already a gimmicky map that not everyone likes, although I do actually like it. Most of the gimmicks work well for the setting, and the map is interesting to play, but those enemies are a nightmare. So the skill they have is the Devil skill, and usually most generic enemies in the Andaron Saga don't have skills, which is great because I don't have to check every single enemy on the map, just to see if the skills will screw me over. So the first issue is that this is the first time these enemies appear, and there really isn't that much of a reason to check their skills, and even if there was, it's a fog of war map, so you can't even check them during preps. Which means that for some people, and that includes me as well, the very first unit they attack might just happen to have wall luck and just instantly die. Which is not fun. Even if you're not playing Iron Man, this just forces you to reset the game because of some RNG bullshit, and it just wastes your time. If you want to introduce an enemy like that, make sure it's done in a more controlled environment where you can't instantly lose a unit, or maybe give the player some hints. But why do we even need an enemy like this? The map already has plenty of interesting gimmicks. We don't need another gimmicky enemy type that either does nothing or can kill your units out of nowhere. And besides, we already have a new enemy type in this chapter with the Mimic. And that enemy is a lot more interesting. Funnily enough, if the Eyes were stronger opponents, they might have been more interesting, because there would be less of them on the map and backfiring would do a lot less damage. Right now their defenses are so low that every backfire does huge amounts of damage. There are ways to counter the Eyes. The game offers you higher luck caps, and some of your units can become immune to them, but there are already tons of things you need to worry about on this map, so it just ends up being annoying and it doesn't really add anything to the gameplay in my opinion. I did actually enjoy most of the experimental maps except chapter 5, as I said. I got so used to the varied objectives that the one generic map, the teammate map before you go and save chicken tendies, seemed really boring to me. It felt like there wasn't a whole lot going on, mostly stationary enemies and you just move towards them. The other map I didn't really like was chapter 30. The penultimate maps are usually a big intense battle, but this one is just a slog, where you have to go through a bunch of heavily armored enemies and reach the boss quickly enough. It wasn't particularly hard, especially after the grueling chapter 29, but it was a little tedious since all the enemies are the same and they're all very tanky. The last chapter was actually really good. I'm usually not a big fan of boss battles, and a lot of Fire Emblem games tend to have easy bosses that you just slap around with your 20 legendary weapons that you've accumulated throughout the campaign. But here the boss was interesting to fight, and was challenging without having ridiculously overpowered stats and skills. He isn't even that strong by himself. The other minor complaint about the map design is the liberal use of Fog of War chapters. The Thracia fog doesn't really bother me, I don't think it makes that big of a difference honestly. And generally the chapters where Fog of War is used make sense thematically. but there's just so many of them. In conclusion, this is a very high quality ROM hack, there's no denying it, even if you disagree with some of the design choices. You'd almost think you were playing a mainline Fire Emblem game if it wasn't for the occasional horny lines of dialogue and random memes. I'm hoping that we see similar high quality ROM hacks in the future, who give equal attention to all parts of the game, not just map design or story, and hopefully we'll get more people interested in Fire Emblem modding.